Hello, I'm Andrew Adonis. I'm a former Secretary of State for Transport and former Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you personally, but I wanted to share a few thoughts with you for the outset, because this is one of the big themes of our future as a country, is how we make our communities livable and how we build more communities based on the hugely successful experience of the garden cities, beginning with Letchworth and Welwyn Garden City, and developing now with the idea of green cities and towns, the proposals for new settlements on the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, which of course go quite close to some of the original garden cities, and how we might combine the benefits of having highly connected communities, which is hugely important, with also having thoroughly livable cities too. And in the 60s and 70s the idea was that this involved having roads everywhere, and Milton Keynes being the exemplar in many ways of a city substantially based on road transport. I think increasingly it needs to be public transport, and in particular accessibility to rail hubs, which means two things, which I hope that you'll be able to discuss in the conference today. The first is building new settlements on the line of existing rail routes and making much better use of rail facilities, rail stations, reopening stations where that's possible, and seeing that most new settlements are within walking distance of a station. I think Network Rail itself could play a big role in this by making available land around rail stations and redeveloping stations themselves. In most major cities now, most new development is accessible to public transport, and in particular stations, and going up and being prepared to have denser development around stations is very much the future. And of course the archetype of this, increasingly both for business and residential use now, is Docklands and the building of a new city built around a public transport spine. The second issue, which I floated in a big speech at the Institute for Public Policy Research recently, is the reopening of railway lines which were closed by Beeching or thereabouts, serving large towns and the potential for communities that could develop in size, and which should be reconnected by reopening rail lines. There were 30 towns in England of more than 25,000 people, so sizable settlements, which lost their rail connections in the 1960s, which it would be perfectly viable to reopen those connections, either they're on existing rail routes or without too much additional new rail lines, they could be reopened. I think that would be a good policy to pursue, and that's partly new places which would then get rail connections, places like Washington in the northeast, one of the original new towns in the 1960s, an almost a city actually of around 40,000 people that has a closed freight line going through it, which has been mothballed for 30 years. A whole set of communities in the northeast could be joined up by opening that line. Places like Haverhill in south east of Cambridge, which could be connected. Cirencester, only a few miles away from Stonehouse Station. A systematic programme of what I call reverse beeching lines, which I think could be funded by not proceeding with some of the less justifiable parts of the road programme, like the £2.5 billion proposed for the Stonehenge tunnel. If you put that into a reverse beeching fund, you could systematically reopen these stations and lines, and they could become a magnet for new settlements. These are very livable places, many of them are extremely attractive historically, which lost their rail connections, and if they got them again, these could be really big centres. But we're also talking about districts of towns and cities, because large parts of cities, this isn't properly understood about beeching, but a large proportion of the beeching closures actually involve closing railway lines going through cities or stations serving cities. So for example, the North London line in North London, which is now the London Overground, was a scheduled beeching closure. The service was massively run down in the 1960s and 70s. It's now the core of the London Overground, one of the most successful rail development projects in history, and is a source for massive development in Camden, Hackney, and across the whole of the route of the line in North London. And this could be done with the building of metro systems from disused or partially used rail lines going through cities on the model of the North London line, the Manchester Metro, which goes up to Bury and Altrincham, using existing rail lines, but then trams in the city centre. And by the intelligent putting together of existing rail lines, reopened lines, freight lines, and reintroducing trams in our city centres, again, you can connect up city districts and suburbs in a way that makes them far more livable and means that people living there can make use of public transport instead of having to be either isolated or be dependent on cars. So I wish you all the best for your conference today. There are big themes to discuss, but I think the principle of action for development in the next generation should be every significant community should be within walking distance of a station, just as in the last generation we took for granted that every new development had to have its own roads, and preferably a very big road close by, or else people couldn't function properly. It's a new way of envisaging settlements. It's green, it's friendly, it doesn't involve so much destruction. I think it's the future. Thank you very much.